Okay, welcome back to part 3 of chapter 42 on the circulation and gas exchange. We are finally done with the circulatory system, and the last part of it will then gloss over the respiratory system. I won't go too deep into this. Like I said, this chapter is really overachieving, trying to cover both very complicated system into one chapter. But like I said, I've already weeded and filtered out whatever I can and just explained the very basics of these systems. All right, so with respiratory system, these are actually cells that carry out gas exchange, obviously, that is, they have plasma membrane that must be in contact with aqueous solution in order for this to occur. That's how diffusion can happen. So that's why respiratory surface always have to be moist when we're talking about where they are in the body and what they have to contain. So gas exchange is fast when diffusion area is large and distance is short. So which means then a lot of respiratory surfaces, due to adaptation for efficient gas exchange, they tend to be large and also they tend to be thin. Okay, even if they're not large like bulk wise, but they are like three-dimensional wise, they might be a small little organ as part of the bigger animal, but there could be folds and indentations in there that can lead to, if you were to flatten it all out, that surface area is all the time larger than the entire surface of the animal. So most animals then have respiratory surface that satisfies those two things: large surface area and short distance of travel between fluid and your bloodstream. Okay, so for closed circulatory systems case, you're talking about the diffusion of blood to your interstitial fluid. Um, so for animals, we have gills, trachea, and lungs for that purposes. So for gills, these are actually then the outfoldings of the body surface that are suspended in the water. We already slightly talked about that when we're talking about vertebrates in the aquatic area. So they have usually, like I said, surface area greater than the whole body's whole exterior. That's why when you look at gills of a fish, if you were to ever buy a whole fish and open their operculum and look at underneath look at their gills, it has like all these striations and lines and folds because that's what increases the surface area of the gills. And to promote ventilation. Ventilation is defined as movement of respiratory medium over the respiratory surface. In this case, for aquatic animals, it will be water moving over the gills. And most animals then will either move the gills through the water or they will move water over their gills, depending if they're movable or they're more sessile, like a sessile, like I've talked about with other organisms. So for crayfish and lobsters, they tend to have paddle-like appendages, as an example, in their gills to drive water current over their gills. That way, they're pushing water inside of them. You don't see a lobster like swimming and swinging their arms to like glide and move really quickly in the water. They don't do that. They crawl on the bottom of the ocean floor, and once they find a good spot, they kind of hide there, stay there. They only come out to get prey, etc. So that's why they're not letting water glide, they're not swimming through the water medium. They're using those paddle-like appendages to push water into their gills. Mussels and clams, same thing. They're pretty, sessile animals. They just stay pretty stagnant, sedentary. They don't really move around very much unless they have to. So they use cilia on their cells to move water through their gills. Octopuses and squids, then those are the guys that are swimming around in the ocean. They can ventilate their gills by movements. And how they move is they take in a bunch of water and then they eject that water out. And we talked about that as jet propulsion kind of deal. When that's how they can move and change direction really quickly and maneuver through water. Fishes, then, of course, is another movable species where the motion of swimming, swinging, flapping their fins, and those swaying of their body, those coordinate movements of the mouth and the operculum, such that when they, open their mouth for water to come in, their operculum will open as well, and that will allow the gills to ventilate. So their mouth is kind of like acting as our, nostril, and then the opening of the operculum is kind of like then the out exits of the gas. So gas will move in through their mouth, gas will move out, then out their gills through the operculum. All right, so their gill system, when we talk about fish, they rely on something called countercurrent exchange to make ventilation very, very efficient. Um, so, countercurrent exchange is talking about the exchange of substance between two fluids that are moving in opposite direction and also changing in the concentration gradient as they move along a length of vessels. So, like I said, this is what makes ventilation very efficient for fishes. Don't worry about the nitty-gritty of how countercurrent exchange works. Just know they have it, and this is the gist of how it works. There, I'm going to show a video animation later in a bit, next to see what's happening. But you don't have to know like, oh, what concentration going is this way, that way. Don't worry about that. But it is a way that we use in the kidneys as well for very effective exchange of materials. But well, we'll see if we get to that in the urinary system. So, as blood enters the gill capillary, this is the gills right here, and within the gills, there's all these capillary beds within there. So, water is moving through the fish, and water is moving through the gills, as well as the blood is moving through the gills. So, as blood is moving through the gills, capillaries, they will encounter all this water coming in as the fish is swimming around, and they would complete their passage through the gills, the whole entire gill. So water tends to have more oxygen than blood, hopefully, or else they would go into a hypoxic state, not enough oxygen. So water should have more oxygen than the blood, just like how air should have more oxygen than our blood. So oxygen will then diffuse from the water into the blood, and as blood continues throughout its passage through each of these capillary beds, the oxygen content will increase as it moves through the passage. Same thing with the water coming in as well. So this, sort of gradient of concentration is what continuously favor the oxygen from the water moving to the blood throughout the entire length of the capillary. So that's basically the gist of what countercurrent exchange is, and here's a video that explains that.
The respiratory organs of aquatic animals are called gills, which in bony fish are covered by a stiff flap called the operculum. Here we remove the operculum so that the gills are visible. Gills are outfoldings of the body surface specialized for gas exchange. Because oxygen is far less plentiful in water than it is in air, the gills of active animals such as fishes must be very efficient to obtain enough oxygen. The gills in fish obtain oxygen from water as the water flows over the gills. Oxygen-rich water enters through the fish's open mouth, passes through slits in the pharynx, and flows across the gills, where oxygen diffuses from the water into the bloodstream. The oxygen-poor water then passes back out to the environment. A closer look reveals that the gills consist of multiple pairs of filaments supported by gill arches. As water flows through the gills, the filaments are surrounded by water. Notice that blood vessels run through the gill arch and branch into each filament. Red indicates that a blood vessel carries oxygen-rich blood. Blue indicates a vessel carrying oxygen-poor blood, blood whose oxygen has been depleted. Where is the oxygen-poor blood coming from?
Where? The body, right?
As blood circulates through the body tissues, oxygen is used. Thus, the oxygen-poor blood comes from the body tissues, where it then returns to the heart, which pumps it to the gills. After the blood is recharged with oxygen in the gills, the blood continues on its journey and carries this oxygen to the body tissues. Next, let's take a closer look at a gill filament to see what happens to the oxygen-poor blood coming from the heart.
That's the countercurrent exchange coming out.
Each gill filament bears many rows of plate-like lamellae that are the actual respiratory surfaces. Each lamella is full of tiny capillaries. Here we show the path of a single red blood cell as oxygen-poor blood coming from the heart flows through a larger vessel and then enters one of these capillary beds. Notice the color change of the cell from blue to purple to red as it travels through the capillary bed, picking up oxygen from the oxygen-rich water that flows through the gills. The red blood cell then enters the blood vessel at the other side of the capillary bed. Blood from that vessel flows into the larger vessel in the gill arch and then circulates to the body tissues. A process called counter-current exchange makes fish gills highly efficient at extracting oxygen from the water. Countercurrent refers to the flow of two fluids, blood and water, in opposite directions. In our diagram, blood flows right to left through the capillaries. Water is moving in the opposite direction, left to right, as it flows through the gill filaments.
Okay, that's what we mean by countercurrent exchange. It helps to see that visually by animation versus just me talking through it or like drawing things and make it look messy. So, and that's all you have to know about countercurrent exchange. But I like that introduction about how gills work, which was something we're not familiar with. We just know fish have gills, but how does it work to do gas exchange? So there you go. So second type of respiratory surface we have are those that are in insects called tracheal system. It is really a network of air tubes that are, branched throughout the body. So there's a main air tubes, and then there's air tubes coming out of the main air tubes, and then they end in what's called air sacs. So largest tubes are called the tracheae that open to the outside. And there's, of course, like I said, they have to be moist. There's moist epithelial lining at the tips of these finest branches for gas exchange. And then those tips end with air sacs that allows for diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And this is through this network of air tubes that it will bring oxygen to every cell in the body. And because the air tubes are located really close to the cells itself, because it's a very small animal, they don't need the circulatory system to work hand in hand with this respiratory system. So that's something different with insects compared to mammals or other animals, is because of the fact that they don't need a circulatory system to be participating in gas exchange, which is different for humans and mammals. We depend on the circulatory system for our respiratory system to work efficiently. So in many flying insects, there's those cycles of flight, muscle contraction and relaxation, contraction and relaxation, that also help to pump air rapidly through the tracheal system and improve ventilation. So that's kind of like what we talked about in terms of skeletal muscles doing contraction, helping blood flow back to the heart. Similar in this case is just any movement that goes in and out, pushes in, pushes out. That kind of helps with the entire circulation of whether it be fluid or gas in this matter. And third but not least, which is our lungs. Those, animals, vertebrate animals that utilizes lungs these are localized respiratory organs that form infoldings. So gills were outfoldings, lungs are infoldings, which is why when you look at lungs, it looks like a little plumpy balloon versus little, sticky things branching out. Whereas gills, you see all those striations and things sticking out. So that's why the lungs are infolding of many, many surfaces. And there's many, many branches. Start with a big one, branch into a smaller one, and they're subdivided into numerous little pockets or the air sacs that do the gas exchange. In the lungs case, we call it alveoli. So let's go through the process and all the organs with respiration. Yeah, this is really quick. Go through. Okay, so air goes in through your nose or your mouth into the nasal cavity and then towards the pharynx. Those air that come through your mouth go straight towards the pharynx. And within the pharynx, then the air travels to the next section called the larynx. Within the larynx, there's two things. First, there's an opening. Okay, it actually opens and closes. So when you look inside the larynx, there's these, sort of fibers that look like that when it's open, and then it will close up like this as well. So it kind of go open and close. That hole or opening, when it opens, is called the glottis. And then the two fibers that I drew really dark are what's called the vocal cords that allows for opening and closing of the glottis. So when air is moving past the trachea, whether inwards or outwards, your glottis should open to allow that air coming through. Which is why when air coming through other than letting air go in and out, it also produces sounds, which is why we have those vocal cords. So when air moves past those vocal cords, there's those elastic band of muscle that forms your vocal cords will vibrate. And when they vibrate, that's how sound is produced. Okay. So once it goes past the larynx, then you have the trachea portion of the respiratory system, which usually remains entirely open. It does not have anything else to open and close other than the glottis at the top within the larynx. Once it makes it past the larynx, then you have that open trachea. Regardless of pressure of airflow, that hollow tube will not collapse due to having cartilage that surround the entire tube. It's kind of like those little ribs that you see in some tubes that can expand. Imagine some plastic tubes, a plastic tube with those rings around it. Those rings are what's keeping the tube open. So the is not a rubber tube, a really thin rubber tube that can collapse, because we never want our trachea to collapse. The moment our trachea collapse, we stop breathing. So this is why we want to have these cartilage that open our trachea remains open. So back to the vocal folds, as air moves past through the vocal cords, other than allowing us to breathe, it also produces sound. So high-pitched sounds comes from tightly stretched vibrating cords. So it's tightly stretch for high pitch. Low pitch sound goes from looser chords that vibrate slowly. High pitch, they vibrate very rapidly, kind of like a guitar instruments inside your throat here. When you string those, what do you call that? Fan the strings of the guitar, sounds are produced. Same thing here. It's just air that are fanning those vocal cords, vibrating them, giving you sounds, high pitch or low pitch. And then the trachea will then divide into two bronchi, left and right bronchi, which are a little smaller than the trachea. And then from there on out, it gets smaller and smaller progressively. Bronchi will branch into bronchioles repeatedly to give you a tree-like looking thing. And then from the bronchioles, eventually it will end with tiny little air sacs called alveoli. Alveolus for singular, alveoli for multiple. So that's why they also call these lungs, the inside of our lungs, the bronchial tree, because it looks like an upside down tree with the tree trunk and all the branches of the tree. So it gets progressively smaller as we move from the trachea onto the tips of the alveoli. Epithelial lining of the major branches of respiratory tree is actually covered with cilia and also mucus. They form what's called the mucus escalator. Now, this is very critical because what's supposed to be flowing into your lungs, into those bronchi and bronchioles, is not solid or particles. The only thing that's supposed to be going in there is air, okay? Oxygen and carbon dioxide, nothing other than that. So if any solids were to move into there, whether it be tiny, tiny things like pollen or dust, it will cause an reaction where you start coughing like crazy to try to get back up, because that mucus and cilia is for the purpose of moving things out away from your lungs. So if anything happened to go into your airway, the mucus would trap those dusts and particles and pollen, and then while they're trapped in that thick layer of liquid that's covering your airway, little cilia on top of those epithelial cells will start pushing. They synchronously just push it up one at a time, one section at a time, until that piece of gunk, whatever the mucus is filled with, whatever particles it has trapped, will move up into the pharynx. And from the pharynx, it can come out of your nose or come out of your mouth, depending on the case. If you hack it out of your mouth, or you blow it out of your nose, which is why we have a lot of mucus in our airway, for the good purpose of trapping things if any solid was to happen to go in there, and be able to expel it out of our body, because we don't want anything other than air to go into our lungs. All right, so gas exchange in mammals occurs within alveoli, just like how in blood vessels, gas exchange cannot happen within arteries or veins. It only happens within capillaries. Same thing here for respiratory system. Gas exchange cannot happen in the trachea, cannot happen in the bronchi or the bronchioles. It only happens within the alveoli, which are these grape-like clusters of balloons at the ends of the bronchioles. So within each group or cluster of alveoli, you can see that is actually covered by a network of capillaries. So this network of capillary kind of wraps around the alveoli like a fishing net. And so when oxygen enters the alveoli, the oxygen will then just be dissolved into that moist mucus layer within the alveoli, and then it will cross that thin surface, because what's between the capillary and the air within the alveoli is just the epithelium lining, single layer of the alveoli, and the single layer of the endothelium of the capillary. So it's just two cell distances in a sense, very thin membrane surfaces that those oxygen have to diffuse through. So this is why within the alveoli, oxygen can be diffused very, very efficiently through that short distance we talked about. And what creates that large surface area is that we have millions of these little grape-like clusters of alveoli, and each alveoli is shaped like a balloon. All that curvature gives this extra surface area. Going back to the theme of respiratory surface should have huge surface area and also short distance of travel for gases to diffuse through. So oxygen travels from alveoli into the blood capillaries, and at the same time, carbon dioxide travel from the blood capillaries into the alveoli so it can be breathed outwards outside of the body. So if the respiratory airway, let's say somehow does not have cilia, either maybe you have you're born that way, or if you smoke a lot, a lot of chemicals within smoke, cigarette smoke, actually destroys cilia, damage the cilia. So that can be removed from your epithelial lining of the airway because you're putting literally toxin into your airway when you smoke cigarettes. So when you don't have enough cilia, the alveoli is actually very susceptible to infection. You never want any respiratory infection to go all the way down to the alveoli. That's when you will suffocate and die. That's when you have pneumonia, which is why some people die from COVID-19 infection, is because of the fact that that virus likes to infect our lower respiratory tract, which includes our alveoli. So alveoli is our precious little balloons inside our lungs for gas exchange. Without alveoli, you can have all the trachea and bronchi you have, you will suffocate to death because no gas exchange can happen anywhere else but the alveoli. So that's why if any bacteria, pathogens, dust, I don't know, whatever particles that are small enough to get into there, that small, they can cause inflammation. And any inflammation within alveoli can lead to irreversible damage. Just like scarring of the liver, you can have scar tissues or things that are damaged within the alveoli that you no longer can use that particular alveoli for gas exchange surface. So smoking, vaping is not safer than smoking. The only advantage vaping has is probably you limit the secondhand smoke that you're giving to people around you. But other than that, what goes inside you goes inside. It is still toxins going inside into your body through your airways, damaging your alveoli. If that accumulates over time, of course, it won't happen very soon, but with years and years of chronic smoking, it will catch up to you, either gives you lung cancer or emphysema, etc. A whole bunch of, respiratory disease you can have with that. All right, so what keeps these balloons nice and, round and open and hollow? Because we talked about how alveoli is filled with mucus. So those mucus can stick to each other as such that your alveoli can collapse and now it's stuck next to each other. So alveoli is supposed to be nice and open, but there's a layer of mucus around it for the diffusion of gases. But if the alveoli was to stick to each other like that, and the mucus keep it stuck like that, now you no longer have an open, nice, hollow balloon for gas exchange, for gas to fill up that area, which is why in normal alveoli, you're supposed to secrete surfactant. Surfactant is an oily substance that will reduce the surface tension and keep the alveoli from collapsing like that. Now, of course, there are diseases where people don't produce enough surfactant and their alveoli collapse and become flat like this every time they breathe. The problem with that is, of course, you're not going to get enough oxygen, and you have to take a really, really deep breath to expand those alveoli. And then every time you breathe, pretty much have to be a big breath just to expand those alveoli, get those gas in the alveoli, and allow for gas exchange. So it was in the 1950s that Maren Ellen Avery did the first experiment that links surfactant deficiency to respiratory disease syndrome known as RDS. RDS is a life-threatening disease of newborns that used to kill 10,000 babies annually, and that's a huge number in the US at that time. So it was all due to this lady, a scientist, that discovered if you were to give surfactant and be able to give artificial surfactant to these babies, they would survive. So usually RDS is most common among babies that are born before 30 weeks of gestation, which means a preterm baby. If artificial surfactant are given to these baby, it would limit the adverse effects of RDS. And if the baby weighs over 2 pounds, statistically, they say that giving them artificial surfactant will have no long-term consequences or effects on their lungs, which is amazing. Because what's scary is, remember we said any damage to the alveoli is irreversible. So when you don't have surfactant, who knows what it does to the alveoli, what kind of damage it can have on the walls of these alveoli, and they're very fragile because they only have one layer of cells. So thankfully, just if as long as the baby is over 2 pounds, if you give them artificial surfactant, there will be no long-term effects. All right. So what allows for breathing to happen? We talked about the parts that has to do with breathing. So what drives the movement of air into your lungs? First, if we're talking about frogs, they have what's called positive pressure breathing, where they inflate the lungs with some sort of forced airflow by pushing. Okay. Remember, the key word here is pushing for positive pressure, because we're going to talk about on the opposite side of that, the negative pressure with humans. Okay, so we're on the frogs. So when they inhale, the muscles of their lower floor of the amphibian's oral cavity lowers like that, which draws air into through the nostrils into the oral cavity. So that when the oral cavity rises, it pushes all that air into their lungs and force down their trachea into their lungs. And then when they need to exhale, air is expelled through elastic recoil of the lungs, compressed of the muscular body wall, so that air will then move out of the nostril. Okay, so it's all pushing of by their oral cavity muscle wall that allows for this amphibian frog to inhale and exhale. For birds, it's slightly different. Okay, so birds breathe by passing air over gas exchange surface only in one direction. So air sacs on either side of the lungs here, anterior as air sac, here's a posterior air sac, and they're located like this within the bird itself. And they kind of act like little bellows. You don't know what bellows is? You know those spring thingy you can blow the fireplace with, blow air into a fireplace or blow air into a balloon. That's what bellows. Okay, they kind of look like this with the little springing action in there. That's my best way of drawing it. From the top, they kind of look like this. All right, that's from the side, that's from the top. That's how bellows look like. And within there are tiny channels called parabronchi that goes within the lungs that serve as sites of gas exchange within the lungs itself. So air is then passed through the entire system, 2 cycles of inhalation and exhalation. So air, the first time around, will go in towards the, of course, oral cavity into the posterior air sacs, and then is exhaled from the posterior air sacs into the lungs. Then, during the second inhalation, that air, or the oxygenated air, will then go from the lungs towards the anterior air sac and then breathe out as deoxygenate or exhaled through then the mouth cavity, which is why it takes 2 cycles of inhalation and exhalation to compare the whole process. All right, so for birds, this is actually very efficient because incoming fresh air never mixed with whatever air that has already carried out gas exchange. Whatever air is coming in, coming out of the lungs, it's always filled and packed with oxygen. They never get mixed with the oxygen or air that does not have enough oxygen. That's not the case for humans, unfortunately. So mammals, such as humans, use negative pressure breathing, which the key word there is pulling air into the lungs. They say to think about what happens with a syringe. So when you pull the plunger on the syringe, that's a pulling action that allows air to go into the syringe. That's how lungs work, okay? So ventilation, in that sense, is like a big syringe in your lungs that allows for the pulling action done by your diaphragm and also your rib cage that allows air to fill into the lungs. I'm not going to go over the physics of this, but because there's an actual law that drive this process, just know that when you change the size of your thoracic cavity, it changes the size of your lungs and also allow air to either flow in or flow out. So for inhalation to occur, your diaphragm has to contract. Okay, oops, oh, I end up erasing that. That's not erase. Okay, that's highlighting. Contract, and so diaphragm contracts and lowers the thoracic that little diaphragm muscle, which enlarges the thoracic cavity area. In addition, rib muscles also contract to pull the ribs and sternum upward. That's why there's all these arrows here pointing upward. So both the action of the diaphragm and the rib cage is expanding as much chest cavity as you can have. When you increase the volume of the lungs, it will lower air pressure, which then air, just like solutes, they always move from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So pressure has dropped inside the lungs, so air now moves freely in towards your lungs by the concentration gradient of gases. All right. For exhalation, it is usually a passive process. We're talking about normal exhalation in this case. No contraction is required. All your diaphragm needs to do is relax, which then pushes up on the chest cavity. Your ribs now goes back down into its original position, which then squeezes the amount of thoracic cavity volume you can have. When the volume is smaller, pressure then goes up. Well, now the pressure is higher than the atmosphere, so that causes the gas to move out of your body by going from an area of higher concentration or higher concentration of gases to lower pressure of gases. Pressure, not concentration, pressure of gases. Okay? So that's how inhalation and exhalation work. But during exercises, this is then where contraction is required. Your muscles is required to contract when you're doing what we call active exhalation. Okay, so when you're just breathing out normally, you don't require contractions of muscles at all. But during exercise, then you will need to forcefully contract muscles of both the neck, back, chest, all work together to further increase the volume of your thoracic cavity, raise that rib cage, and then the motion pushes and pull on the diaphragm along with the rib cage will then increase the efficiency of pushing and pulling, pushing and pulling. That way, it will then allow you to inhale, exhale very, very quickly, of efficiently moving oxygen in very quickly and moving carbon dioxide out very quickly. So they give an example of about kangaroos where their movements actually creates a rhythmic movements of all the organs in its abdomen, including the stomach and liver, that kind of act like a piston-like pumping motion that allows for it to do all those large hops as it's exerting all that energy for fast inhalation and exhalation. So here's a quick video that goes over
Whether you're
pulmonary
racing in a
ventilation.
triathlon or doing something less strenuous, you need to breathe in oxygen to help you get energy.
So it shows you that volume changes of the thoracic cavity.
And breathe out carbon dioxide, a waste product. When you inhale, your diaphragm and rib muscles contract,
There you go.
increasing the volume of your lungs.
Volume gets
When
bigger.
you exhale, these muscles relax,
Relax.
decreasing the volume of the lungs. When the lungs expand, air pressure in the lungs drops, causing air to flow into the lungs.
Like a balloon.
When lung volume decreases, air
Push
pressure
all that air out.
increases, causing air to flow out of the lungs.
Okay, so that's pretty much how pulmonary ventilation works. Just showing you by animation how that movement of the diaphragm. They didn't really show the rib cage because it is mainly the diaphragm that's doing most of the work. There, the rib cage helps a little bit more, um, but you see how expansion of the chest cavity increases the lung size and therefore drawing air into itself. All right, so the last slide for this chapter is then talking about how there's respiratory adaptations for diving. There's many different respiratory adaptation. There's also adaptation for people that live high up in the mountains or animals that live high in the mountains. But we'll just talk about diving in this case, which is pretty cool. So respiratory adaptation for some animals have allowed air breathing mammals to swim underwater. Not only can they swim underwater for prolonged periods of time, they can remain in there in very, very deep parts of the ocean. So one of those examples is Weddell seal of Antarctica. They're actually able to dive to as deep as 200 to 500 meters. Most human beings can only dive up to 20 meters before something goes wrong. Um, so they will remain there for a period ranging from anywhere from 20 minutes to more than 1 hour. So why we cannot go any deeper like the Weddell seal is because as we go deeper and deeper into the ocean, just like how we go higher and higher in altitude, the amount of oxygen also decreases, as well as all that water pressure gets higher and higher and higher, which then puts a lot of pressure on your lungs. If your lungs cannot expand properly due to all the pressure pushing on your body, then you cannot breathe. Okay. But for these animals, they are able to do that. And on top of that, somehow they're able to remain, underwater for long periods of time. So what are those evolutionary adaptations? First, they're capable of storing large amount of oxygen in the body. For us humans, we're very limited by the amount of blood vessels we have, capillaries, and also the amount of blood we have, erythrocytes for storing those oxygen. And yet we have all this high demand of energy living as a human being, having a closed circulatory system, needing to supply brain and heart with a lot of energy. So some animals have the capacity to store more oxygen within their muscles or within their blood vessels. And then muscles also maintain a high concentration of oxygen storing protein called myoglobin. And for us, we have a little bit of that, and especially in our heart muscle, because we know our heart cannot be completely deprived of oxygen. So that's like our black backup plan. I didn't talk about that, but we do have that, but not in high amounts. For these diving animals, they have a lot of myoglobin as an extra source of oxygen storage. Not only do they have hemoglobin around their blood, they have myoglobin that's existing within their muscles. So as a result, the Weddell seal can store about twice as much oxygen per kilogram of body mass than a human being, which is why they're able to last that long in underwater. In addition, diving mammals swim with very little muscular effort. For us humans, that is not the case. We swim with a lot of effort. At least for me anyway, I'm not a good swimmer. So when I go swimming, I feel like I'm exerting my entire body's energy just to stay afloat and, go across the pool. So for marine animals that dive, they can glide passively for prolonged periods underwater without having to constantly flap their fins and tails constantly. Well, that is cool. I wish I can glide passively through the water with my arms, but we don't have that adaptation because we don't live underwater for a very long time. We don't need to be in water for a very long time. So during a dive, because of how little muscular effort they have to exert, their heart rate and also oxygen consumption rate goes down, which makes then ATP, you don't need to do aerobic respiration very much because you're not, going crazy underwater. It's just a smooth and chill mode, gliding through the water, and you need very little oxygen. So they can do anaerobic respiration for a while before they need to come back up for air. Blood supply to the muscles is either restricted or completely shut off for extended dives for these diving animals so that you don't need to move those muscles as much because like I said, you don't do a lot of muscle movement. They're just gliding through the water. So most of the blood is then routed to vital tissues such as the brain, spinal cord, eyes, and adrenal glands for their movements underwater. And pretty much that is all I have for you for chapter 42. Like I said, I did skip some of the sections, but you see how long this chapter is and packed with information. I cannot afford to put more stuff in here. So I try to go pick and choose whatever I think is interesting and also important basis of these two organ systems. I hope you have enjoyed it. So let's go through these practice questions and then we'll be done with the chapter. The fluid that moves around circulatory system of typical arthropod is B. Hemolymph. We already talked about that multiple times. The normal contraction of specialized atrial cells results from the activity of the what? And the simultaneous contraction of the left and right atria is due to what? D. So we have all the rhythmic pacemaker cells for doing normal contractions, and it is the gap junctions, which I didn't really talk about because this is a concept about cardiac muscles having intercalated discs. Those are the gap junctions that allows flow of ions through the cardiac muscle cells very quickly, so that one cardiac muscle cell can communicate with the neighbor cardiac muscle cell very efficiently. So that's how it allows for contraction simultaneous of left and right atria. So here it is. I talk about that gap junctions. Okay, as in Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart, a heart can continue to beat after it is removed from the body because, not to bring up a creepy story, but just to make it interesting, I guess, for the textbook, that pacemaker cells can contract without any input from the nervous system. Okay, after blood enters the right atrium, it then enters the what? Right ventricle. So be expected of this type of answer. Be very clear about the routes of circulation because that's what's important within the heart and the pulmonary circuit and systemic circuit. You will see a lot of this type of questions on the exam. Which of the following have valves within them to prevent blood backflow? Blood backflow. Veins. Vein is the only one with valves when we're comparing the three main types of blood vessels. Which of the following organisms breathe through tracheae? Insects is the only one that have tracheae system with the air tubes and everything. Why is the net movement of diffusion slow for distances greater than a few millimeters, even though they seems very short for us human beings? Well, because diffusion time is proportional to the square of the distance. Which of the following is not a component of the basic circulatory system? We talked about the three basic components. So oxygen carrying pigment is actually not a basic component, but it is a part of our blood. The fluid should have cells that carry those pigments. But the three basic components, fluid, the pump, and the vessels. Which of the following is a disadvantage of a closed circulatory system compared with an open one? Closed circulatory system uses more energy, which is what I mentioned before as well. And starting from the right ventricle, which of the following is the correct sequence in the circulation of blood through mammalian heart? Very important. I know this question seemed crazy. I won't ask it like this, but I thought I want to put it in here so you're clear about the order. All right, so the answer should be B, where you start with the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, you go into the pulmonary arteries. From the pulmonary arteries, you go to the capillary beds of the left and right lungs for the pulmonary circuits. And then from there, you move on to pulmonary veins, which then brings blood back into the left atria of the heart. From the left atrium of the heart, blood then travels towards the left ventricle by passive filling and pumping. Left ventricle from there on out then goes towards your aorta. That's the pumping of ventricle, pushes blood into the aorta. From the aorta, then it goes towards your capillary beds throughout the body, your systemic circuits, which then comes back all of veins that goes through your superior and inferior vena cava, finally back to your right atrium. Okay, which of the following is an evolutionary adaptation of diving animals that enables them to remain underwater? We just talked about that. They have some variation in their alleles that increase the concentration of myoglobin in their muscles. Respiratory distress syndrome, it results from deficiency in what in premature infants, which is not produced until the fetus reaches a certain what? Surfactant, and then is not produced until they reach a certain weight, which is why it is usually after 30 weeks of gestation. And that's all I have for you for chapter 42.